Good evening, everyone. So, welcome. Today is a day for celebration. It's the 40th anniversary of an entity whose sole mission is to conserve and protect the natural environment of Sri Lanka, also assuring a sustainable future for the country, for the people, and also our biodiversity. It's a tall order, you may think, and you may say, but Environmental Foundation Guarantee Limited, or EFL as we know it, has been an environmental watchdog since its inception in 1981, safeguarding the natural environment in our interest, the public. It's always been a challenging journey, as you can imagine, but there are some great successes too that EFL has notched along the way. EFL is a non-profit public interest litigation and scientific research organization whose work ranges from litigation to action-oriented conservation and research projects and has catalyzed change through collaborative efforts with public and private sector national policy framework and formulation. So today our webinar is all about it being time to pay your rent, build back better with nature. The goods and services given to us by our ecosystem is essential for our survival. They support and sustain economies and also stable governance. But this is all something we actually take for granted. Informed science-based decisions are the benchmarks of environmental stewardship, and businesses must develop innovative ways to make sustainable contributions to nature conservation by adopting nature-based solutions. Before I introduce our keynote speaker today, I just want to inform you that we will be having a short Q&A straight after our keynote speaker, just for him. And if you would like to ask him any questions, please go to the EFL host account and send in your questions. He would also like to have all your videos on. So please put on your cameras because it's always good to have interaction. So for our keynote speakers time, would you mind all putting your cameras on so that he can see you and have an interactive discussion? So while welcoming you all again, it's now the time to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Valmik Thapar. He has spent 45 years serving the interests of both wildlife and very specifically tigers. He is a fierce defender of the tiger and all wildlife that lives in the forests of India. He is extensively engaged with South Asia. He's passionate about the African continent and spends 6 weeks every year somewhere in Africa. He believes in reform and change in both the mindset and the model of governance being followed. He also believes in public-private partnerships and relationships and an overall and an overhaul of the Indian Forest Service. He believes that wildlife tourism can make a strategic difference for both wildlife protection and also to local communities. His keynote address today will be about his life's work with wildlife and the dilemmas we face in keeping the natural world safe. Mr. Thapar, over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the first time I'm looking at a computer screen and talking to an audience, so you will excuse me if I blunder along a little bit. First of all, congratulations to EFL for 40 years and their anniversary. I don't know the detail of what EFL does, and I don't know the detail about the issues in Sri Lanka, but I do know that we globally are all connected. And horrifically, what has proved that is this pandemic of COVID. Wherever it started, whether it was a leak from a Chinese laboratory, whether it was mad Chinese scientists chasing natural bat caves, or whether it was because of animal trade, which was illegal in China, somewhere along the line, someone destroyed, degraded a forest, hit an animal, created more pollution, created the possibilities of crippling a globe, crippling our planet. And I have never seen a planet crippled like I have seen in the last year and a half. Combined with that are the natural disasters that have taken place. From typhoons to cyclones to floods to droughts, they are taking a toll across the world. And they are taking this toll because we didn't care. We are a globe of yappers. We yap, 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 but do very little. And that is what governments do. Endless conferences, climate change, global warming. But where's the actual field result? That is really important. So at this moment of time, let me put it like this. I've had a lot of time in these, now my 46th year is starting, to reflect what I have done, what I've seen. And I have followed the tail of the tiger for 46 years, but I've done lots of other things. I was on the expert committee of mining for my country. I was on the expert committee for hydroelectric projects for my country. And through this process of following the tail of the tiger on all these issues, I completed 38 books, traveled across widely around the world from New Zealand to Caracas, giving talks, trying to inspire people. And to some extent, not very successfully. If I look back, there are more failures than successes. But in the essence of my life, if I was to say that these years were spent fruitfully, and I'll give you one example. From 2002 to 2007, I served a 5-member Central Empowered Committee of our Honorable Supreme Court. It was an experiment done by the Chief Justice then, where 5 of us were given a courtroom. We wore formal clothes and we heard all environmental cases of big business, of wildlife, of forests. We were argued by the topmost lawyers in front of us, and we reached very detailed advisory judgments. For those 5 years, our judgments were sent to the Supreme Court, and in 90% of our advisory judgments, they were all approved. And it was an amazing time because government, in their nefarious ways, couldn't intervene. They were stuck by the power of the Supreme Court. We had many foreign delegations from different countries who visited our court to find out how this was working. And we found a way in which environmental issues were a priority. We also found a way to get those who used bits of forest, bits of fragile lands, bits of wetlands to pay. So roughly 2-3 years ago, through the original decisions of the Central Empowered Committee in 2002, over $1 billion went to the exchequer for improving the environment, for improving nature in general, for improving the forests. So this to me was a great idea. This is an idea which should be taken on today in terms of how nations look at green issues and how they are going to get themselves much stronger. The other idea which I found and find more and more fascinating is an idea that I spoke of in Sri Lanka a few years ago. It was about a global university where you can study the earth sciences, where you have many different interdisciplinary disciplines, where you get 500 to 1,000 students to do long-term courses, short-term courses. You get government officers to come and refresh their normally ignorant brains, to get them activated, to get them in the mode of decision-making. I still believe, after I suggested this idea in Sri Lanka, that this is a need of the day. We don't require the billionaires of the world to shoot off in space and see how planet Earth looks. We require them to do things which are going to save planet Earth. And for that, we require a younger generation, a new army, to go out there, well-trained, educated, and where a global university like I'm suggesting of earth sciences could play a critical role, because when you're young, you want to talk to people who you're empathetic with. An astronomer may want to talk to someone who's working with water. How does water and the catchment of water affect forests? How does that happen? Vice versa. The understanding of these things in detail, good ideas, good solutions for the future. So I think this is a really important area in which we need to focus and get the super rich of the world to come down to earth and do some of this instead of buzzing around space. That, I believe, is vital. The next thing which I found over these 46 years is decision-making. I found that when you have a passionate politician who believes in the environment, who believes in wildlife, who believes in the fragility of nature and how we need to respect it and give back to it, the entire policy of a country changes. We've had only one such person, and that was Indira Gandhi. In her time, she changed all the laws in India to bring in laws which were green laws, whether it concerned wildlife, whether it concerned the environment, whether it concerned forest conservation. I've worked with 2-3 prime ministers. many chief ministers in my region, and except for one in Rajasthan, Vasundhara Raje, I found no one else with that passionate political will. So it's really important to get political leadership to embrace ideas. And if you're unlucky, where you don't have a politician who's really interested in the environment, then the bureaucrat, who is a key player, he lives for 40 years, 30 years, he rules the roost, and you can't get your way. So after looking at this scenario, I believe the time has come to share decision-making. If you have a huge forest area and you have a government director of it, you should have on his side on contract the best expert who knows that forest area, who understands the science of that forest area to take decisions. He's like the shadow of the director, because most of our directors who run these things are not well trained. They do not understand the intricacies of nature. And it's therefore vital to find a team which is made up of non-government experts and government experts to come in and share the decision-making. They can be on contract, they will be paid and get the same designation as the so-called bureaucrat who wants his status. So will these people get status. There's nothing in our law that can stop it. Most countries contract people who are experts, and they go and find themselves in departments and ministries. But we need our younger generation to be in decision-making. No longer is there a point in doing a PhD which the government dumps, or giving advice to the government which is stores in a file. The time has come. As you can see, climate change is not setting in, it's set in. The time has come to share decision-making, to take rapid decisions and get some action going. If we do not get this action, we do not share decision-making, if every government officer sits on their throne, if every politician believes that he has the answers for the public at large, we're going to lose it. Because saving the environment, saving forests, and saving wildlife is going to give a quality of life to this planet for the poorest of the poor, for the richest of the rich. There's no different, there's no distinction. COVID and the problems that COVID has created, natural disasters across the world hit everyone. They cross the boundaries of our countries. And therefore, it is vital to get an army together, to train them well and to give them decision-making. No more committees of advice, no more yap, because I've done it. I served 200 committees of my government. I know how much yap time goes on, and everyone claps at the end of it, and you hope the next day a new dawn comes. That dawn doesn't come like that. It requires people in the field to take decisions to prevent damaging projects, to prevent the negativity from spreading. And if our politicians don't have the passion, they need to go to a green school. They need to have a refresher course for 3 months in a global university of earth sciences. And we have to fight and campaign for that, because the wrong decision can have huge damages. And over 10 years, one action creates another reaction, and everything starts snowballing into a disaster. And I also believe somewhere that we have to find people who don't treat a job as a job, who have a passion, who are able to commit themselves with an integrity which is beyond belief. These people are there. We are just not able to pick them and pluck them and assess them. There are lots of boys in the villages. Ranthambore Tiger Reserve is the root of my learning. I know about all the local communities. Some of the boys haven't gone to school, but their common sense, their ability to come to defend nature is there if you give them their respect, if you give them their due, give them a little more knowledge. You know, if I had, my views and my failures are that every year for 46 years, if I had trained 10 boys in Ranthambore's villages, there would have been 500 today. That's an army around a national park in an area where you have nearly 1 million people within a 15-kilometer radius of your parks. Water. It's so important to keep your wetlands. It's so important to keep your lakes alive. People don't realize that. I know that in the Ranthambore Tiger Reserve, when the lakes are full, all the water in the wells is full. People have water to do whatever they like with. But the minute the water dries out, or some foolish government scheme to build little dams to check the water, to stop the water takes place, suddenly the water starts drying from the underground table. It's again that process of how one action creates another reaction. My idea this evening was to just throw some of these ideas to you, because 46 years is a long time. I'm now in my 70th year. I go on fighting, I go on writing books, but it's a toughie because you've spent so much energy, so much time trying to get people and human beings to change ideas. But those who change, those who create reform, are people who have a feeling for nature. Whether in our country, in my country, it was Indira Gandhi. When she ruled, she did change the laws. Those laws still exist and they still minimize damage. My last fact here is, don't always think you can be successful. I made that mistake with my idealism, that I could stop 3 projects by virtue of putting my head into something and a strategy, and everyone said, no, not this project. But I realized 10 years later that the big business of this world finds its way back. They restructure the project slightly differently. They do the worst environmental impact assessments. They wait for a moment when they can be more sympathetic, or the politician and bureaucrat in charge can be more sympathetic to them, and then they reapply and the project starts all over again. So it's really important to go on fighting this, not to worry about defeat. Remember that in this world of the environment, nature in general, and the great magic of nature, once you've experienced that magic, there is no other magic in the world. It's what keeps the world going round and round. Minimize damage, that's what we are doing. We are minimizing damage, and it's really important to minimize damage because you give the planet more and more years to live and breathe. That's really the crux of what I want to say now. And you may not have questions for me, but this is my essence of all the years. And I've done all kinds of things in my years. I tried never to leave a stone unturned, to get into every nuance and detail. But these 3-4 things after these 46 years to me are really the most important. I wish EFL the very best for the next 50 years, 100 years. I hope a younger generation comes and goes on fighting for the beauty of nature in Sri Lanka, for the beauty of nature anywhere in the world. I hope somewhere a global university comes into being where hundreds of people get well trained and travel to different corners of the world to put their tentacles into the battle for nature, the battle to minimize damage. Thank you.
Mr. Thapar, your passion is infectious. How do we translate that passion, and hopefully what EFL also has, into public sentiment, into saving the environment? It is almost an uphill task. Like you said, we can wait for governments to, or regulators and big companies to do something, but maybe at some stage we need to start small. How can we get that part galvanized?
You see, in my country, I've thought about this a lot, and it's not only an uphill task, I sometimes think it's an impossible task. But let's look at big business. We are not short in any country, whether it's Sri Lanka or India, of big businessmen. We have the most ridiculous television channels, electronic media, where we look at all kinds of rubbish. Even our news reporting has become a drama, a theater of the absurd. You know, everyone puts on to see which is the next spectacle that's going to take place. We have to persuade one rich, huge conglomerate that the time has come for a serious channel about the quality of life. How is our population going to live? About documentary films, about the amazing nuances of nature that keep the world going round and round. We've not succeeded in that. I have 100 news channels in India, and one worse than the other. I barely can watch them. Okay, we have a huge development of all kinds of entertainment, but to what extent? Everyone says use social media, tip on this, like we are talking now. Great, there are great things about social media, but there's huge evil with social media. Okay, a lot of our problems we can't solve because of social media, because there's another lot banging you with a lobby that you cannot counter.
Right, so I agree. But look at big business. Everything, they work out. People, planet, profit, triple bottom line, reporting standards, everything. But at the end of the day, it's all about economics. How do we change that mindset? How do we get them to sincerely give it back? That sincerity of action, which is hard to find.
I'm not sure about that because, again, in 46 years, one thing I've learned is about greed. The human ability for greed, for wanting more and more, is infinite. In the 1960s, UNESCO in Paris held a huge seminar on a new design for living in terms of how people could live more simply and consume less. And it was a big thing in the 1960s. But 50 to 60 years later, we've regressed so much because of greed, because we emulate this great, rich, luxurious style that everyone has to have. We don't stop. So I don't have an answer to that question. I'm not a person who can give you answers. I can only give, with all my honesty, what I faced and how I think these are areas and interventions where you minimize damage. I don't have faith that a big businessman will appear from somewhere and say, okay, I'm putting my $2 billion not in going up to space, but I'm going to put it into something which is magical for this world. Okay, people are forgetting about the magic of nature, which keeps them alive. So I think this is an impossible solution. If you're asking me for solution, I don't have it.
Ravi, I think you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question from Mr. Thapar?
Yes. Mr. Thapar, thank you for a wonderful and inspiring address. I just want to know the 5 panelists appointed by the Supreme Court, whether they were all non-lawyers or people with a non-legal background.
One was me. I was with the non-legal background. One was a Supreme Court lawyer who ran litigation and looked after a lot of green laws. He's still there, by the way, in the Central Empowered Committee. But the Central Empowered Committee has changed slightly after 2007 because we now have a green tribunal, which has branches all over India. So a lot of the work of the Central Empowered Committee of the Supreme Court went to the Green Tribunal. So there was one lawyer, one retired senior bureaucrat from the Ministry of Environment, one really magical guy who was a forest officer, but he was a tough nut for anyone to crack. And these 5 people worked very well. We had a great unanimity of purpose. It's changed now. The committee still gives advice to the Supreme Court, but the Green Tribunal deals with more and more cases. But we set something in motion where the Supreme Court now relies on advice on green matters, whether it's the tribunal, whether it's the Central Empowered Committee.
Is that okay, Ravi? Mr. Thapar, what is the role civil society can play in actually, do you have any examples where civil society has actually raised concerns and actually made an impact of some sort? It may not be the 100% solution, but is there any examples you can give us?
I mean, there are examples across in our history, in our recent history. We had the great Chipko movement in India, where in the lower Himalayas and upper Himalayas, hundreds and thousands of people hugged trees, and we had a movement to save all our timber by that process. So the trees were alive. We have the Bishnois, which is a local community in the Rajasthan desert, the little bit of desert ecology, desert wildlife, natural water in the desert is only alive because of them. They chase poachers, which were mainly a lot of people who were the rich around, who lived around the desert. They will kill a poacher if they kill the Indian gazelle. Their god is the Chinkara, which is the Indian gazelle there. There are other small communities who worship in a place called Javai near Udaipur. They worship the concept of the leopard. We have a leopard alive where there's no prey. The leopard lives on a few dogs and a few goats, which are nomadic goat herders throw for them. But in the cracks of these rocks, this incredible geological formation are caves and tunnels. So we have a population of 100 leopards, which are alive there. There's no forest department. There's no government. There's no forest, but the leopards still live and you can see them on top of these rocks. So if you search hard, there will be examples, but they are less and less in the world we live in because everyone wants to exploit more and more because of the concept of greed.
If we are to entice big business to think deeply, any idea how we can do that?
Well, I would start with someone triggering a meeting of 10 or 12 people who at least 10% have a sympathy towards green things, and put them in a beautiful natural situation. It could be looking at the sea, which is very possible in Sri Lanka because you have the most beautiful oceans, housing them there for 5 full days and brainwashing them. So when they leave, they know they have to be committed. And you have to get a bunch of brainwashers to sit there and go for them, who have done their homework, who know every nuance of their functioning, who are equals in their eyes. And then only will business start to lift itself out of this morass it's gone into, where all these things don't matter much, because you can always say, I'm employing so many people, I give people jobs, I'm developing the economy, I don't need to look at those things. But in their employing people and developing the economy, there are lots of negatives also. We have to tell them those negatives, because there are minds full of talent in every country who know exactly what the negatives are and how you can damage any fiber of nature whenever you choose to.
One last question, Mr. Thapar. If big business, given that big business is always, whether we like it or not, working on profit, if we are to get them to go green in some format, there is a cost. How does that balance off on their balance sheets and to their shareholders?
I don't know if I was a shareholder, and I am, if I was a part of a business organization, and I know my family who's a part of business, I'd say thank you so much for losing a little bit of your profit to keep the planet safe, to keep human beings alive. What is there more important, to run a business for profit or to keep our planet alive? It's as simple as that today. There are too many people dying because of environmental disasters. We require business to do what it has never done. And there's no choice in between, because if we want to live and talk like this across a screen and celebrate more anniversaries, then that's what business has to do. That's what politicians have to do. That's what bureaucrats have to do. There's no more important job to be done but looking after every green issue on our planet.
And do you think stakeholders can push for that and actually get companies to do their bit?
I hope they do. When I meet any friends of mine who are in big business, and I know several, I give them a piece of my mind. And you can imagine what that must be like. And some of them have changed a little bit. Some of them have started to put a little bit of what they earn into other issues. I can only do what I can in my limited life, in my own way. But if more and more people did it, and I don't do it diplomatically, I say what I like straight on someone's face. Don't play hide and seek with the person, because that I've never done in my life. Nature taught me, be transparent, be straight, be honest, say what you like to whoever it is, whether it's a prime minister or whether it's a sarpanch in a village, speak your mind.
Thank you so much. Lots of takeaways there for us. And thank you so much for your time. I do hope whatever mission and vision you have does come true, but it's a long haul. But hey, we have EFL here as well. So we'll be working on it.
You're very welcome.
And hopefully the passion will be infectious enough.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thapar. Okay, so we now move on to our panel discussion. We have 3 panelists with us. Just a reminder, we'd like you to send your questions on the chat. We may not be able to answer them all due to time constraints, of course, but we will certainly give it our best shot. Let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Eric Vikramaniac is the Director of Wildlife and Wetlands at WWF Hong Kong, with over 25 years of experience conceptualizing, developing, planning, innovating, supervising, and leading conservation projects across several countries in Asia, including Bhutan, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Laos, PDR, Nepal, Malaysia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Vietnam. And he currently chairs the board of directors of EFL and has led UNDP-funded projects, including training government spatial planners on integrating biodiversity priorities into development plans, developing landscape and basin-scale conservation strategies, and preparing Sri Lanka's 6th national report to the CBD. Hasanthi Dissanayake, welcome Director. She's the Director General Ocean Affairs, Environment and Climate Change at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She's working on promoting Sri Lanka's role in international, regional and sub-regional organizations within the spheres of ocean affairs, environment and climate change to strengthen the objective of those organizations and pursue Sri Lanka's image as a bridge builder, thereby enhancing dividends for the country's interests. Dr. Lalanath Silva is our third panelist. He's an attorney at law, is one of the co-founders of EFL and led EFL as its president and later as executive director for 2 decades. He currently serves as the first head of the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund, established under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He graduated from Sri Lanka Law College with honours, obtained his LLM from the University of Washington Law School and his PhD from the University of Sydney Law School. He has nearly 40 years of experience as a litigator and legal advisor and has held positions in national committees, international organizations and institutions including the UN Compensation Commission, World Resource Institute and Asian Development Bank. We'd like to start off with Lalanath, given that he's been with EFL from day one, literally. So, Lalanath, just please take us back to some innovative approaches that EFL has been involved in public interest litigation, access to people for environmental justice, and also, subsequently, the laws and strategies and framework to mainstream the Sustainable Development Call for greater access to justice. Lalanath.
Thank you, Savitri. Let me share my screen with you here. Welcome everybody to this 40th anniversary and congratulations to the Environmental Foundation Limited for persevering through these 40 years, through difficult times and undertaking many a battle on the frontiers of environmental conservation. I have 15 minutes, so I'm going to jump straight away into this presentation and to speak today to you about legal innovations for sustainable development. This, I believe, is the main legacy of the Environmental Foundation. Now, this legacy that Environmental Foundation has built over the last 40 years is really, truly full of innovation. When we started off, I still remember we had to deal with a whole bunch of very old laws, most of them enacted during colonial times. And then on other matters, there were simply no laws at all. We're talking here about the 1980s, the beginnings of the 80s. And there were new situations that were arising. As Valmik just mentioned to all of you, companies coming in and taking over lands, logging them, poaching in the wildlife reserves, pollution, air pollution, water pollution, etc. All of these were they were new situations in that they were the magnitude with which it was happening was quite astounding, and they all required solutions. And the way we got to those solutions, or actually some of those solutions, because clearly the problems have only increased and we have not solved the problems entirely yet, is through innovation. And innovation is what truly built this legacy that the EFL has created. And in doing so, we had to go, in most cases, from the impossible to the possible. What I want to do today is to deal with, in making this leap of faith, if you like, there was always a certain amount of creativity that was required of the EFL staff, of the lawyers and scientists who were working with EFL. There was a high degree of courage needed, because believe me, the numbers of threats to your person, to your family, to your property was innumerable across the board. And it also, of course, meant taking risks to yourself, risks for the organization itself, and then finally, persistence was the key factor that we had to all believe in truly in order to continue with this work. And through all of this, through these innovations, through this creativity, there was a lot of learning going on, because believe me, there were many times, as Valmik said, where we lost, where we were defeated, where we failed. But each of those failures, each of those defeats was also an opportunity to learn to hone our skills, to improve what we were doing and to make it better. I want to talk to you about 6 cases that I remember very well, either because I was counsel in it or participated in it, and to tell you about a little bit more about these innovations, because I think they are to some extent truly inspiring. The first of these has to do with political interference, a common thing that we heard from our keynote speaker today across the board in many countries, not just in Sri Lanka. And this was one of our early cases, the Karagang Levai case, where a company wished to take the Karagang Levai down in the south of Hambantota, a very beautiful natural salt lake, if you like, and convert it to a salt turn and a factory. Now, this required a permit from the Coast Conservation Department, the CCD. And what was really interesting was a very high political figure had written a letter to the Coast Conservation Director saying, "So and so is my friend. Would you please grant a permit?" Now, this is clearly political interference. It's what we call dictation in law. And so we went down. I remember my colleague who is here on participating on this workshop, Ravi Algama, and a few other colleagues. We went down to the Karagang Levai. We surveyed it. We walked around it, spoke to the people, and photographed it. And what we were really looking for was a periodic or permanent connection between the Levai and the sea, and that we found. We found all overgrown with jungle and with vegetation. So we documented this, we mapped it, we came back, because the moment a water body is connected to the sea, it comes within the jurisdiction of the Director of Coast Conservation. And so with that, we filed a judicial review application in the Court of Appeals. And interestingly, the Court of Appeals did grant us a stay order. And for 2 years, the project was stopped. The project developer lost interest, and the Levai was saved for a long time until the Hambantota harbour came along. Our second case was, again, to do with intergenerational equity, another important principle in sustainable development. This was during a power crisis. We had many power cuts, and the government said any private company can just start up any old generating facility and we will buy the power because we are in a crisis. And so a company established diesel generators, 5 or 6 of them, in the heart of Navale, in the middle of residences. And there was 24 hours of white noise being generated by all of this. There were children there. There were adults. They could not sleep through the night. And so we brought an application to the Supreme Court for a violation of fundamental rights. And what was interesting is we decided to bring the case in the name of 5 babes in arms, little children, 1 month old, a few months old. And I still remember the case when it came up before Justice Mark Fernando at the time, the late Justice Mark Fernando. One of these babies started to cry at the back of the court. And he asked, "Why are these children here? You know, they should not be in court." And I had to tell him, "My lord, I'm afraid they are the petitioners in this case and therefore entitled to attend these proceedings." And so there's a little twitter on the bench, and they said, "Well, we can excuse them. Maybe they can stand outside so that they don't need to be, to undergo the stress of the court proceedings." And here again, a stay order was issued. The generators were shut down, and very quickly the developer came to a settlement to pay compensation and to close the facility down and take their generators somewhere else. The third case was, again, to do with political interference. And this is, of course, the famous Candelama Hotel. And there's a picture right there of the hotel, which you can see is vegetated, very well camouflaged, and certainly has now won many awards for being the environmentally most friendly hotel in the island. This did not come about just by chance. It came about largely because of the adverse publicity that this case brought to the hotel and its company. So what happened here was the hotel was given a piece of state land because the great Mr. Bawa, with whom I have a great respect as an architect, decided that this was the best place for this hotel. And so without any impact assessment, without any study of the environmental consequences, because there was unfortunately no environmental law at the time, environmental impact assessment law in Sri Lanka, the state went ahead and just handed over a parcel of state land, no documentation whatsoever, just a word of mouth, go start your hotel. And so we had to dig into the remote corners of the laws, of the regulations, and there deep, very deep in the rather obscure land regulations, we found that when the state like this was giving a preferential lease, it had to be advertised in a gazette. And the public got 6 weeks during which objections could be filed. Objections had to be inquired into before a lease could be granted. And so using this provision, none of this, of course, had been done by the state. We filed judicial review applications. And I still remember the first day we retained Mr. H.L. De Silva, the late H.L. De Silva, President's Counsel, to appear for the case on behalf of EFL. And it came up before the then President of the Court of Appeal, Justice Sarath Fernando, and I still remember Mr. Choksi appeared on the other side, the late Mr. Choksi. And as the argument began as to whether the hotel should be stopped by a stay order, the court began to fill because the word got out that there was a battle ensuing in court. And indeed, the court did issue a stay order. And ultimately, they had to follow these proceedings. Some 5,000 objections were filed. And so though it was a temporary victory, unfortunately, the land commissioner overruled all 5,000 objections. And this is really unbelievable. This is sometimes what happens. And the hotel went ahead. But as I said, the good part of this is that the hotel is today one of the most environmentally friendly hotels because they took it to heart that they will show the public that they can also try to do something good. The fourth case involved a dereliction of duty. And it had to do with the private zoo in Ahongalla. A permit had been issued under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance for this private zoo by the Director of Wildlife. There was very poor care of animals, and there was danger to the public because the way in which these animals were being displayed, sometimes just tethered to a post by a chain, and that's what happened with the lion. Not even as in the picture here, there was this lion which was tethered and tied by a chain, and you could approach it, come very close to it. And many would say that these animals were drugged. And one fine day, we decided that it was important to have this zoo shut down because we felt that private zoos were not authorized to be licensed under these rules. And so we took the matter to court, judicial review. We heard the application was heard. And unfortunately, we lost that case, although the judge did recognize the right of EFL to bring these cases, standing to bring cases was recognized. On the merits, he said, no, the director does have the right to issue this. So we appealed it to the Supreme Court. And here's what happened. While it was pending in the Supreme Court, a little boy, some 8 or 9 years old, on a school trip from Polgahavela, went over to this hotel, to this zoo, and took a photograph of his friend on a borrowed camera, which he had borrowed from a neighbor in his village, and then told the friend, take a photograph of me, I will stand by the lion. And as he stood by the lion pounced at him, mauled him, and he died. And this was public news. At this point, the bureaucracy woke up. Everyone was very, very angry. There were protests outside the zoo. The Director of Wildlife went down with all his staff and then closed the zoo down, took all the animals and took them back to the government zoo in Dehivala. So when this case came up in the Supreme Court, I did tell the court that this could have been prevented if we had the correct judgment in the lower court. And so that was another interesting case, which we did as a result of the dereliction of duty, of public duty. Defending the defenders. This is another thing that EFL has done in the past. And here was the case of Faiz. Faiz was a wildlife protection officer, a dutiful wildlife protection officer. He went out on receiving information in the Polonnaruwa area, and there inside the wildlife area, he found a number of loggers, some 50 people logging away at the forest. So he arrested all of them with his staff, and he was bringing them back to the city to file cases against them, to prosecute them, when the politician, the local politician and a minister who was from that area came on the scene and asked him to release these people who apparently were supporters. And he said, no, I can't do that. I'm going to do my duty. So what did they do? They went to the police station and lodged a false complaint against him. And by the time he got to the police station, the police were ready to arrest him. He was arrested and put in a cell. This is the public officer, the wildlife officer. And while he was in the cell, these politicians went into the cell in the presence of the police in the police station and assaulted him and injured him. So that's what happened to this wildlife officer. So after he was released from hospital and on bail, he came and met with us, and we brought a case in his name for violation of fundamental rights. And the court had some very interesting things to say in that case, the Supreme Court. It said that these officers had a public duty to arrest the politicians, particularly when a crime was committed in their presence. And they went on to penalize these officers with compensation payments, as well as the politicians who were private citizens with compensation payments. And they particularly said, you will pay for this with from your own pockets, and the money will not come from the treasury. So there you are. That was another case where we innovated and developed some new jurisprudence. And the last case I have is animal rights. And this is an elephant who's actually tethered. As you can see, all of its legs are tethered morning, noon, and night. It's only taken out to be shown for some to the public as part of an elephant show, and then it's brought back and tethered here. And very sadly, this particular animal had a mate, and his name was Raja the zoo elephant. These elephants are so badly treated that this particular elephant killed 2 of its mahouts, one after the other. And at that point, the director of the zoo decided that it's time to sell the elephant off, to auction it, and so decided to advertise this elephant for a public auction. And Sagarika Raja Karunanayake, who was then a member and a wildlife and an animal rights activist of Sattva Mitra, came to me and said, look, none of the lawyers seem to want to take a case or have advice for me. What can you do? So we put on our thinking caps, innovations, and we said, we looked into the law. There was nothing much in the law, but there, buried in the government's financial regulations, which control public auctions by government officials, it said that there are certain kinds of specialized goods that need to have a pre-qualification. You cannot just sell it to the public. You need to ensure that it's getting into safe hands, that the person who's buying it can actually handle that particular kind of property. Unfortunately, elephants are treated as property under the law even to this day. And so using these, we went to court. And what was really interesting here, the innovation was that we brought the case, amongst others, in the name of Raja the elephant. Do animals have rights in courts before the law? And since my time is limited, I will not go into this, but there are many historical examples in, at least certainly one big example in the Mahavamsa, but also in our Jataka stories, where we recognize that animals do have rights, legal rights. And so in that particular case, ultimately there was a settlement. The director of the zoo promised that he would not do this in the future. And we were given an opportunity to take a vet and examine this animal in the premises of the person who actually had bought it. And thankfully, it had gone into good hands and was being cared for well. But that is the last case I have for you. And I want to end, here are some paper cuttings from that period, by saying this, that EFL was a pioneer, not because it was a first in so many different ways, but because it invaded legal frontiers with innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lalanath. I will move to Hasanthi because we would like to leave as much time as possible for our Q&A. By the way, do send in your questions to the chat box. It's open now. And also, if you have anything while watching Facebook on the live stream, we will be using those questions as well. So whichever medium you're on, please go ahead. Hasanthi will be speaking on the economic value of oceans, blue carbon, and she will also share insights on the vision for the management and sustainable utilization of marine resources for our future and also Sri Lanka's international obligations. Manavi. Can I speak with Hasanthi Dissanayake? Sorry.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can all hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Good evening. Good evening to all of you. And I would touch upon a few things that Savitri told about. And thank you, Savitri, for the introduction. Well, I'll start with saying that if we take Sri Lanka, which is an island state, we depend on the quality and availability of our coastal resources, and we need to exploit this natural capital sustainably while improving overall economic well-being and social equity. So if we really reflect on our recent past, The government has recognized the importance of the unique coastal habitats and the ecosystem services that they provide, including buffering the impacts of climate change. And we are one of the first countries in the world to adopt an integrated coastal zone management as a governing mechanism. In fact, this was introduced in 2015 under Blue-Green Development Strategy, where we emphasize conservation and sustainable management of lands and oceans. And if we consider this needs carefully tailored coastal zone management policies that caters to diverse economic interests and to reconcile competition for resources, integrated multiple sectoral considerations, and steer implementation and practice towards gaining long-term sustainability. Among the key highlights of this blue economy or ocean economy is to sustainably manage the attractive and resourceful sea coast of 1,600 odd kilometers without causing environmental pollution and degradation. And then how are we going to deal with our ocean mineral resources to add value and benefit from that in a sustainable manner, and then oceanic navigation and port facilities to ensure that we also prevent marine pollution. And if you really look at the blue economy, there are different aspects that we consider. What first comes to one's mind is Sri Lanka being developed and promoted as a trade and maritime trade and logistic hub. So for that, what do we require? We have to, increase our capacity with being able to handle cargo, provide port services, have capacity to address maritime disasters, immediately respond to those, and things like that. And then, of course, coastal tourism. And now we also have whale watching, dolphin watching, turtle hatcheries. Those things are also connected. Coral reefs also are part of that ocean economy and connected to tourism. Then, of course, we also have a component of which is happening, which has just started to happen for tourism, is the maritime archaeology. And so there are lots of wrecks around Sri Lanka. So this is something which will become in the years to come more popular, but we also will have to regulate it in a way that it will not impact on our artisanal fisheries and the sustainability of our resources. Then the potential of generating energy from the ocean, and then production of medicine using oceanic resources. I think we'll have to have a lot of technological background and development to reach to that point. And it is also connected to the ongoing process happening globally on the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, where you look at ocean resources. And then connected to that is also the International Seabed Authority. In fact, our foreign ministry has started a process where we formulated a stakeholder committee and working on a system where we try and get training for our special junior officers from relevant stakeholder agencies to deal with resources in the seabed, but where we can really make use of it might take another 20 to 30 years. So we have started a process where we try to engage with International Seabed Authority and get our junior, let's say just fresh graduates and other junior people in ministries, universities trained. So this is a process. I told about the process that started with the Coastal Management Plan in 2015, and coming to 2019, there is the Vistas for Prosperity of the president, which also talks about a sustainable environmental policy, and he speaks about a national policy framework where ocean resources will be utilized in a sustainable manner under the concept of blue-green economy. Now, moving forward with that, Sri Lanka has now committed to renewable energy, to achieve renewable energy 70% by 2030. And we have also pledged that there won't be no more coal. And we are looking at becoming carbon net zero by 2050. It is at 2060, but before COP26 happens in November, we expect that we will revise it to 2050. Also the Vistas for Prosperity also considers about improving the status of Ocean University as a university involved in research and studies related to oceans, and that Sri Lanka can use coastal and marine resources more effectively. So it's a long-term plan for the university. And the policy also focuses on natural ecosystems that will be conserved while actively restoring and rehabilitating degraded ecosystems. And then environmental education is also an aspect that has been given significance in this policy framework. And there was another policy document which got cabinet approval in April 2021, looking at sustainable solutions for climate change. And under that, as recent as in July 2021, a task force and subcommittees were set up to look at various aspects of how we can arrive at better situations to address climate change issues, as well as taking best use of ocean resources. And it also has a huge component on how we can reformulate our education and higher education systems to make people interested and knowledgeable and understand about sustainable development, protection of environment, and generally the importance of biodiversity. Then when it comes to fisheries, we have to ensure that there are two aspects for fisheries. We have the artisanal fishing, and then there is high seas fishing, where you need multi-day boats for artisanal fishing. And then there is also mariculture, which involves where you work on marine organisms and it's cultivated. So trying to balance artisanal fisheries, which is also close to the coast, as well as mariculture, to make a balance there is needed. Of course, we have learned in the bitter way that farming of shrimp and other things is not as sustainable as we thought originally, perhaps, and the importance of conservation of mangroves for various things, including protection from phenomena like tsunami and storm surges and all that, and the power of regulating the soil being washed off and nutrients getting run off to the sea, and salinity coming off to the ground. So in that sense, mangroves make a good buffer. So importance of mangrove is being felt, and it is, I think, in 2019, about nearly 20,000 hectares of land which have been abandoned after being used for salt pans or as shrimp farms have been identified for rehabilitate or restore for mangrove. So I think that is a very good thing which has happened, and there are quite a lot of programs which are done by the private sector as well as NGOs, Sri Lankan Navy, and all these are done in collaboration with the Forest Department and the Biodiversity Secretariat of the Ministry of Environment. And at that point, I would also like to share that Sri Lanka is the lead country for the Commonwealth Blue Charter Mangrove Action Group on mangrove ecosystems and livelihoods. And there is a very good example of how nature-based solutions are happening. Last year, for the International Mangrove Day, there was a replanting which was done in Pubudugama in Putlam district. And by January, when we launched something called Mangrove Caretaker Program with the support of the British High Commission, at the same area, we saw how some species of snails and fish has come into the area where the mangrove saplings were planted. And then other than those were planted, the natural vegetation, including mangrove saplings of different kinds, have come up. So you could see what was planted and what has come naturally when the right environmental conditions were created. Then, of course, we actually need to ensure that when it comes to fishing, that we balance. As I said earlier, mariculture, aquaculture, artisanal fishing, and also the deep sea fishing. So in this context, Sri Lanka needs to move forward with marine protected areas where we have different levels of management to ensure that fish breeding happens, and certain areas, let's say for other shrimp types, crab types to grow in a particular season. So we need to really identify those. So to do that, we have to first do the marine spatial planning. I hope in the next year or so, Sri Lanka would be able to go towards that. There had been preliminary discussions about this. And so that's something that we have to start very soon, marine spatial planning. And we look at within that declaring maritime MPAs, marine protected areas. It is extremely important. I'm also telling this in a interesting context of Seashells. Let me just read something about it. Seashells Initiative is aimed at supporting sustainable and long-term use and health of marine resources throughout Seashells EEZ. And how they are going to do that is that their Ministry of Finance, Trade and Blue Economy has developed a number of innovative economic mechanisms. The first one being a debt swap. The Nature Conservancy, a conservation organization, is facilitating a debt swap between government of Seychelles and its Paris Club creditors in exchange for government commitment to enhance marine conservation and climate adaptation. I think this is a very innovative system where Sri Lanka can also look at. And in fact, with this, the debt buying back agreement is worth $30 million with the Paris Club group of creditors and South Africa. And as a part of this debt swap, the government has committed to a marine spatial planning initiative, expanding marine protected areas to cover 30% of EEZ, which is 400,000 square kilometers, with 15% designated no-take areas. So
Hasanthi, could we speed up, please, because I'd like to get Eric also on to speak.
Right. Okay. So so that is something I think Sri Lanka can look forward to do. And among other things I could say is Sri Lanka is also heading the IORA Working Group Maritime Safety and Security, and we are going to be the Vice President of IORA. So if we are focusing on promoting regional collaboration to work on the areas that I talked about, fishing is one area, then tourism, and how we are going to get use of sustainable, using marine resources sustainably and in an equitable manner within IORA would be key things that we could work on, and also preventing marine pollution, especially plastic pollution. We saw the ramifications of the Express Pearl disaster, which made us all realize, even in recently a global ministerial meeting also, other speakers, UNEP Executive Director also highlighted the issue of plastic nurdles on the oceans. So these are some of the things that we need to look into. Some of the collaborative activities, and Foreign Ministry also was involved in a process where we developed a national framework on submarine cables. So those are the types of work that we have been doing with the Foreign Ministry and engaging. And I think with the role of IORA Vice Chair and then Chair, Sri Lanka will be able to do quite a lot of sustainable utilization of resources together with the other countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Hasanthi. I just want to shift to Dr. Eric Vikramaniac. We titled this webinar, Paying Your Rent. Let's Build Back Better with nature-based solutions. Can you just elaborate on how the corporate sector and its reliance and how the reliance on ecosystem services, how does it actually work?
Savitri, can I just share my screen and make a brief introduction first? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Let me see if I can. Do you see my screen?
We're seeing half of it.
Okay. This is always a challenge for me.
We can see your screen, Eric. I think you just need to
maximize it, I think.
So, yeah.
How's that?
Nearly there.
Dr. Eric, you need to swap the display.
Yeah. Okay. Is that better?
Perfect.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So our planet is broken, and we broke it, and now we are in deep trouble. So last month, the UN's IPCC released the latest report, and it flashed a code red for survival of humanity, and it alerts us to increasingly extreme heat waves, droughts, and floods. And remember that this was an intergovernmental panel report, which was arrived at by consensus. So it's very conservative. The real situation must be much worse than reported here. So now we are facing what's probably the greatest existential threat to humanity now in our lifetime. This is a screen grab I took a few weeks ago for another talk, but if you do the same now, it'll probably look very similar. But just take a look at what's happening all across the world. Severe storms, droughts that are causing massive floods and fires all over the world. We are already in the middle of a global crisis. So unless we take urgent, extreme, and committed action to mitigate climate change, we will be even in more trouble from which we may never recover. So these disasters are now going to displace hundreds of thousands of people, and these numbers will soon swell to millions. They will lose their livelihoods. People will die, and survivors will not have a secure, stable future. It will create societies of climate refugees with no place to go, but trying to get somewhere that's relatively safer and looking for those safe havens. They will begin to move, crossing international boundaries, and in doing so, they will cause more environmental degradation. That was the cause of the climate crisis in the first place, but desperate people do desperate things to survive. So here's the real face of climate change: chaos, violence, and conflict. There will be conflict as people compete for scarce resources, for food, water, space to live, and jobs and livelihoods, compete with people who already live in these places. Now, if this is meant to scare you or to alarm you, it's meant to. If you have children or grandchildren or plan to, be even more scared for them. Because unless we act now, this is a world you will leave, you will leave them with. But this is not just a projection of the future, it's or a hypothetical, it's actually happening now. So note the date here, August 24th, 2021, just a few weeks ago. Madagascar is now facing a climate change-induced famine. For the last 3 months, people have been foraging for locusts and cactus leaves to survive on. This could very well be Sri Lanka in a few years, because the impacts of climate change are now being manifested in Sri Lanka. We are seeing floods and droughts that hit different parts of the country, sometimes even the same year. It's happening year after year. It's a recurring problem. So here's the face of climate change in Sri Lanka now. Farmers lose their crops because of severe droughts. Some commit suicide because they cannot repay their debts. People are flooded out and displaced because of floods. Livelihoods and lives are lost. Infrastructure that's built at great expense and with public money and debt, and that's you, is drowning. So we are seeing a recurring pattern here of frequent and extreme natural disasters that are causing havoc throughout the country. Welcome to the future. This is just not sustainable and does not look good for stable governance going forward. Can we afford 60 billion rupees a year to deal with the consequences of the disaster year after year? It's taking a toll on economic development and growth, and that affects all of us. You're paying for it. Look at the socio-economic and political situation in the country now. We are being pushed to the brink of a tipping point from which the country will have to deal with more chaos and more conflict all over again. So what do we do? How can we build resilience and develop adaptation strategies and contribute to climate mitigation? One key strategy is to use nature as a defense and as an adaptation strategy and a climate mitigation tool. There is plenty of scientific evidence to support this. It's the very same nature that we have destroyed and degraded and continue to do so that brought us to this state. So let's build back better with nature-based solutions. We have now lost most of our forest ecosystems. We have to rebuild. Almost all the coral reefs and mangroves that are such important coastal defenses, as Hasanthi said, have now been removed. Rivers and streams are being diverted, dammed, and degraded. So we have to fix all of this. Conservation and restoring some ecosystems strategically is no longer a luxury, it's an imperative. It's a survival strategy. Protecting and conserving what's left is essential for building climate resilience and for saving livelihoods and lives. But we have to go beyond the status quo. We also have to restore what's lost in some places. We have to adopt big and bold conservation solutions, such as landscapes with ecological connectivity. Corporates are located in these landscapes, are dependent on the ecosystem goods and services from these landscapes. So the corporate sector has a huge role to play here. It's in their interest of sustainability and long-term survival. So pay the damn rent. You have to invest back into conservation to make these goods and services sustainable and become a committed, vital partner and stakeholder in rebuilding this broken planet. We are fast approaching a tipping point. We cannot just keep relying on prayer. We now have to rely on science, on nature, and to some extent the corporate sector. Because even the deities that you are praying for to help are now trying to keep their heads above water. So they don't expect much from them. So good evening to you, and thank you for listening. With that, I'm happy to take that question, Savitri.
So let me ask you first, Eric. You touched very briefly on the corporate sector and that there should be some stewardship, some responsibility. How do we get their buy-in?
Right. So as I mentioned, the corporate sector is in these landscapes, right? They are dependent on the goods and services that the landscapes provide. They are dependent on the productivity, on sustained productivity from the availability of these goods and services, from the people coming to work, the people who are safe from natural disasters. If they do not invest back into making those landscapes, into making the environment safe for themselves, they will lose their productivity, they will lose their profits. So they have to understand that their bottom line is dependent on a safe environment for them, for their productivity, and for the people who work for them.
Fair enough. So what do you think are the incentives? I think I asked Mr. Thapar this as well, but what would be the incentives for commerce to actually adopt better practices, except for the tick box of getting awards for their reports and that kind of thing? Both maybe Mr. Thapar and Eric, maybe you can answer that. Start with Mr. Thapar.
Incentives? I tried to explain to you what the incentives are. So, I mean, if the corporate sector, if Mukesh Ambani, one of our richest businessmen, or if Ratan Tata, one of our richest businessmen, doesn't understand the incentives of going green, or putting money into green initiatives, putting money into green litigation, sponsoring lawyers, looking at issues right across, it's like Eric was talking about. I mean, I've spent 2 years in the Maldives, and I've seen the Maldives and all the coral reefs going to hell. I cannot educate them. So the incentives are there for them to see. I mean, this is a question which even now in the kindergarten is taught. If our businessmen want to go back to kindergarten, welcome. We'll start a special kindergarten for you. But if they don't understand the incentives, I'm sorry. I'm not going to bang my head against a wall now to explain to them why they should be involved in anything green. They have to be if they want to be alive, if they don't want the industry to die, if they don't want people to get infected with 100 different problems. I mean, there's no way out of this. I mean, look at where the whole world has gone, whether it's the USA or whether it's right down to a small, poor country. Everyone is affected. Everyone's talking about, oh, we are in the middle of climate change, global warming, we've degraded this, degraded that. If the businessmen of the world don't understand that, God help them. God help their brains.
Eric?
Yeah, so look, I mean, Savitri, if the corporates, when they do their accounting, if they actually account for the value of the ecosystem goods and services that they derive and they're dependent on to make their business successful and sustainable, then they will realize and put a value on what they're getting, right? And that should be an incentive. But the problem is all of these are not accounted for, right? In 2020, nearly 400 companies worldwide had joined an international Business for Nature coalition that was established in 2019 with a public commitment to stop the loss of nature. But there is nothing happening since then. You know, about half of the companies have now left that. So walk the talk, but account for these goods and services that you're getting from nature. Your employees are dependent on ecosystem goods and services for their own safety, for their own health. If they miss work because they fall sick, if they miss work because their family is falling sick or caught up in some natural disaster, then their bottom line is affected. So that should be an incentive, right? Why don't we have look, I mean, a lot of companies now have sustainability managers. But why not have a sustainability person, a conservationist and environmentalist on their board to advise them on how they can do sustainable business and invest back into nature, because they're taking out from nature. Put it back, right? The companies are answerable to their stakeholders. To their shareholders, right? They want to do what's best for their shareholders. Why not do what's best for the bigger shareholder, this planet? They have to understand that.
Well, I think that's a bit of a tall order. It's never going to happen, or it won't happen, I don't think, in our lifetime, Eric. And that's what all of you are on about. And it's almost like hitting your head against a brick wall, but there are rewards. Lalanath, do you think that considering EFL's journey and the history of public interest litigation in Sri Lanka, that we as a country should focus more on environmental and climate change policy, or is it more effective to litigate and obtain a judicial precedent? This is a question from our viewers. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you, Savitri. I think the lasting legacy of COVID-19 will be you're on mute, becoming very common these days. I don't think, to answer the question, I don't think it's an either-or situation. I think you need broad policy changes. I think you need broad legal changes in order to change human behavior, in order to provide for the governance framework that is necessary to promote the kinds of ideas we're talking about here. But at the same time, you also need the case-by-case approach. And to be very honest, in many countries, and particularly in Sri Lanka, you could have lots of policies and laws. In fact, we have over 200 laws and policies, over 200 laws and policies put together on one aspect or the other of the environment. The problem, though, is actually in enforcement. The executive branch of government just does not do a good enough job of enforcement, and the private sector, is often, not always, often there are some good people, but often they are also trying to find the loopholes. They're trying to evade and avoid the law and the policies. So all of this conspires to really extremely poor implementation. And that's where you have to, adopt the judicial approach sometimes, case by case. Just speaking from experience, there was a time when I was at EFL, I would wonder, my goodness, we've been working at this day after day, year after year, and the problem is only getting bigger. And I just would throw up my hands helplessly and say, is it worth it? Is it worth it? And the fact of the matter is, just as grains of sand make up the seashore and drops of water make up the ocean, it's case by case, little by little, chipping away at what you believe should be the right way to go is important for all of us to be doing, but at the same time trying to bring about, kind of global change. There's another question, or rather a comment, and also a question, I think, if Savitri let me, from Arjun Gunaratna, also one of our founding members. And he posits a very difficult question, actually. Can you be a true environmentalist if you're also a capitalist, if you believe in capitalism? Because the Earth has reached its planetary boundary, very fast reaching its planetary boundaries. And perhaps in one or two of those boundaries, we may be very close to or already have crossed it. In that situation, is paying the rent, is valuing the environment, while I certainly subscribe to those views, is that still tinkering at the edges? Will we really not be able to achieve, true, get over the existential crisis that we've all been speaking about? I don't think it's, to respond to Arjun, I think we've all identified the problem, and you have too, and I completely agree with you, Arjun. I don't think we have the solution yet. So you can look at capitalist world, and you have huge problems there, as you've rightly said. You can look at the socialist and communist world, look at China and the amount of pollution and environmental degradation there, look at Eastern Europe. None of our economic systems have been able to bring about the healthy environmental and life-saving and nature-preserving outcomes we are looking for. So I don't think we really have an economic system, or we haven't innovated that economic system that will really jive with our requirement, with our need to be within the planetary boundaries and safeguard and protect nature and the life-giving systems we have. That is, I think, also, just as much as climate change is the existential challenge, that is a huge challenge that faces all of our intellectuals across the board.
So, in similar way, this is yet another question. Most of the innovation in the field of environmental law worldwide has come from PI lawyers and innovative judges. So corporate environment lawyers and government lawyers have mostly opposed these innovations. But judges who are willing to innovate and interpret the law creatively have definitely been key to expanding jurisprudence. The trend has generally continued, but there have also been some backtracking in India and Sri Lanka as well. Correct?
Yeah, actually, that was a comment I wrote in response to a question from Mario Gomez. He's a member.
I just took it because I thought it might be nice to discuss it a little further, because it's actually about creative judgments and creative way of looking at.
So if you look at India, and Valmik is here, and he can confirm this. The early litigation in India, led by legal heroes in many ways, as MC Mehta, for example. These were public interest lawyers who, from battered typewriters sitting in their little chambers in New Delhi, would type up petitions, take them to the Supreme Court and argue these cases, and degenerated because of judges like Justice Bhagavati and others, Krishna Iyer and others like that, who were willing to listen to these arguments, willing to be innovative, open up the minds of the legal community, were able to produce the judgments that gave India this outward-looking and very public interest-oriented jurisprudence. But since that time, we're talking about 20, 30 years ago, There have been judgments coming out more recent times from India, which seem to be turning the clock back. There has been a reaction to that from some judges saying we have gone overboard. There have been reactions by academics and by government, of course, saying, you know, this is government by the judiciary, which is not what is expected in a democracy. It's really government by elected representatives and not by appointed judges. So there's been this debate. This debate is going on in India. In Sri Lanka, we haven't had that kind of swing, although certainly Indian judgments are important and they are certainly persuasive. Our judges have certainly been open-minded in many cases and tried to bring about jurisprudential change. But there have been, generally speaking, the Sri Lankan judiciary has been much more conservative in its approach than the Indian bench. And is this right? Is this wrong? I don't know, but there are clearly the problems of environmental issues, you know, continue and they're only increasing. So I don't think we have had enough activism from the bench, as I don't like to call it activism, but actually, you know, just doing the right thing, innovating as they should. So that's the point I was making. But certainly the jurisprudence we have is mostly due to public interest lawyers and to open-minded judges.
Valmik, would you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, I have two comments to make. I think that on the issue of whether a capitalist situation can turn green, probably not. But I like Eric's suggestion, which is a practical suggestion, that every serious board of a big company can have on the board one very green member and expert. Some will be servile, but there will be others who will fight, and it will bring in a change, because those same corporates will be going to court, but they'll be going to court in a different way, in a modified way. So that's important. I also agree that we have backtracked in the last 5 years on lots of judgments. But what happened at the turn of the century, what happened with the Central Empowered Committee is that it started a band of people who are going to fight for the environment, who are going to, they may lose battles more and more, but the fight is on. There is a green tribunal. Some of the judgments of that green tribunal are amazing. The Supreme Court then rejects those, as was said by the earlier speaker. But it's still a debate. There's still a communication between one and the other. So we need to put in some of our green experts into the corporate world, and those companies who try and call themselves green have to show that their board has someone who's green. Otherwise, they're not green, they're black. There are no two ways about this. There are no gray areas.
So could we propose, I mean, given what we have been discussing now, could we propose a UN Commission on Environmental Crimes on the role and responsibilities of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights? You know, internal commissions of also whatever, or punish corporate individuals responsible for environmental damage. Can that be done?
Can I make a quick comment there? I agree that there should be, like you have war crimes, which sits in The Hague. The crimes against what has happened with climate change and global warming are so severe that we can't even keep count of the dead. So we need like a war crimes tribunal for the crimes against environment. And every senior government officer and politician, because you in Sri Lanka, as what I heard, have a lot of political intervention in things. We have the same thing in India at a state level. Unbelievable. They can be summoned to an international crime tribunal for green issues. People have to know they are answerable with jail sentences, if not more serious sentences. This is the only way that all these great international policies will see the light of their people, will feel answerable. So there's some answerability with a war crimes tribunal. Let's call for an environmental crimes tribunal where people are summoned from different countries. What did you do? Why did you clear that? How dare you intervene? Make people answerable. Nobody's answerable. The minute you get into power in this world, you're not answerable. Everyone thinks they're God.
This was actually proposed by a group of lawyers very recently on international tribunal, I suppose, for ecocide. But the problem is, I mean, as with many UN organizations, they lack teeth.
Absolutely.
That's the problem. UN is a very cautious, very conservative animal.
So, what are your thoughts on, or if civil society is paying their rent, are we depending too much on incompetent governments?
I believe so. I don't know what the others say. Incompetence beyond belief, brainlessness. They don't know their homework. They have to read everything to talk. They haven't gone down to the field to understand the nuances. They don't know the language of a forest. They don't know the language of a coral reef. They don't know the language of when a big project comes, how does it damage something 100 kilometers away? They need to go back to school, and we need their IAS courses, civil service courses, training courses to put in a lot of green issues in front of them so that districts, regions, whether you have collectors, I don't know what you have in Sri Lanka, magistrates, they all have a green mind that one action can destroy something else. It's vital. Training is redundant in our part of the region, in India. We have a lack of training of basics.
Well,
How do we get, yes, yeah, please.
No, I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think that's why we need to work on the corporate sector. Because look, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a corporates that run the world, especially the international corporates, not the governments. Corporates appoint governments at the end of the day, right? So if we can influence corporates and whereas governments, politicians see the future in 4-year segments, time segments. Corporates, if it's a responsible company that's beholden to their shareholders, they see the world. They set much longer targets. Maybe in terms of centuries even. So they have a vested interest, a greater vested interest in making sure that there is sustainability in their business, which means they have to invest back into nature so that they can stay sustainable. So if you can influence corporate culture, if you can influence the business paradigm to invest back into nature to make themselves sustainable, I think we can make a lot more headway.
Lalanath, anything to add to that? Civil society paying their rent, but then we are dependent on incompetent governments?
I mean, I don't disagree with anything that that has been said already by Eric or Valmik. I mean, I broadly agree with them. But I sometimes wonder whether the idea of putting value on the environment, on natural resources, and ensuring that those values are taken into account, and as we've been saying, that the corporate sector pays its rent, has members on its board, whether that by itself will adequately address the issue. It certainly will address the issue to some extent, and I'm not doubting that, but I'm not sure it is enough. Because it is not, very often when we speak to the corporate sector, and I've been making this case for many, many years in the different fora I've had to make presentations to, by saying, look, environment and development are not opposed to each other. There are lots of things you can do which will continue to make profit for you. You can actually invest in the environment through your business and ensure that actually you might make even more profit. That argument is good in many cases, but it doesn't serve well in other cases. For example, where we simply have to say an absolute no to some areas. If it's it's an important national park in which you have species which are endemic or which are only found in that location, then you just have to say no. No amount of investment by corporate sector is going to change that situation. You have to preserve it, protect it, and prevent people from disturbing it. So where is the plus of that? How do you pay the rent for that? So I'm just giving one example. There are many such examples across the board where it will be very difficult to put a value on nature and ensure that it gets translated into calculating the value. So all I'm saying is, paying the rent is important. I completely accept that idea. It definitely is something that I believe in, but I don't think that is enough. It is not sufficient by itself. It's necessary, but not sufficient to get us to where we have to get to.
I agree entirely.
I think you also need strong government laws and policies to be put in place, that there are certain things that are just absolutely no. And government is not going to do that unless there is strong civil and citizen backing, and politicians then begin to understand that this is going to cost us votes if we don't put these laws in place and actually enforce them. And we are not at that place. Our publics are not at that place yet. And I think there's a lot of work we all have to do to get them to that place. So there you go.
Hasanthi, in your presentation, you mentioned a lot of areas where Sri Lanka is allegedly doing well in environment, but are we ground reality? Are we actually meeting those by multilateral international obligations when it comes to environment? On the ground, it just doesn't seem like that, but what do you think?
Well, I would say we do meet the conditions that we have committed to, but at the same time, I also see, for instance, every day you see on news areas, forests being cleared, reservoirs being, destroyed, and lots of negative things are coming. And I think also it is a matter of all negative information is becoming news, but what is really happening on ground, good things doesn't get media attention. So perhaps there is more damage happening than positive things, but I think it is needed. What I see lacking is, at the Foreign Ministry, we are not an implementing agency, but I see at the grassroots level, or when I say grassroots level, the forest officers, wildlife officers, fisheries officers, in their small way, they do whatever they can. They do contribute. When something good happens at that level, that never gets publicity, never go to media. Let's say a small project which was done, or something, an activity to heal the environment is being done by the innovative ideas of a forest officer, never gets like, the person will never get anything special, an increment or any recognition. Probably the bosses get the recognition, if at all. And the person who does that not get any publicity at all, or no incentive. So, but there are still people who are doing that. Those things hardly get reported. So with the work that we are doing with mangroves, and we are trying to get seagrass, corals, and some other areas to the fold, what we try to do is we try to project and promote these with the people, because you need to recognize them and support them. You see, when a private sector entity or NGO does it, they have their social media and media networks where it will get some publicity. But when a government official may be going out of the way at a grassroots level, taking a risk, doing something, it never hardly gains publicity. So I think the way media projects things, usually it's mostly when something goes wrong or negative things get projected. So I think that is one issue why things are not getting highlighted.
Mr. Thapar, sorry.
I just want to add one more point. Recently, in July, this subcommittee was appointed. One of the things, obligations or rather duties of this task force, let me read it out: develop the education and higher education system geared at increasing knowledge, awareness, and positive attitude on biodiversity, environmental protection, and sustainable development through curriculum development and extracurricular activities. I think this is something that Valmik Thapar was also emphasizing on. If this happens, at least to have it in a subcommittee as a mandate, important mandate, I think is a starting point. So this subcommittee has not met, and for this subcommittee, they are also getting representatives from ADB and World Bank. This information I came to know only about 2 days before. But what I'm saying is it is starting to happen, and we need to support these processes. I think eventually there would be academic and researchers, NGOs getting involved in these processes. But I didn't see any publicity for this at all in any media or anything.
Okay, so
but this is a starting point. So I'm very positive about it. Yeah.
Okay, let's give Mr. Thapar the floor.
Let me be very clear. The earlier presentation clearly showed how EFL defends the defender. Okay, I also have scores of examples in India, newspaper reports, the media, where we've defended the defenders, forest guards who've given up their lives against poachers and 100 other things. Not one of us will not defend the defender as long as the defender has done the right job. But when the defender does the wrong job, he will be attacked. Like I have a prime minister today in India who for 8 years has not held a meeting of the National Board of Wildlife. Under our law, and you have legal luminaries on your panel, the Wildlife Protection Act states that the National Board of Wildlife should meet twice a year. Now, our media is the opposite. Your media may be different. Our media does not highlight this negativity of the government of India and of our Prime Minister not holding a meeting of the National Board of Wildlife. So, I mean, medias are different everywhere. It depends on what's happening, how servile they are, how honest they are. But we are great defenders of the defender. You are in Sri Lanka and we are. We will never let a forest guard who has fought a battle not be campaigned for, not get the right medal, not get the valor and courage, bravery that he defends. This is a fact of our life. That's why we are in this happening. That's why we are fighting for the environment. So I just want to mention that. You do it with EFL. It's done here in every state of India, and there are 33 states and union territories.
Eric, just to add to that, do you actually think what we have on the ground here in Sri Lanka translates to what is there in government policy and strategy?
I think
and also the role that media plays. Sorry, I want to also ask that as well.
Yeah, that's a tough question, actually. What we have on the ground does not really reflect what our policy expects us to achieve. Let me put it that way. We have good policies. We have we have made good commitments, including in the internet, including international covenants. We haven't met those. But it's not just us. I mean, as far as I know, none of the countries have met their, SDG targets or the CBD targets. So, and every 10 years, every 4 years, we gather in some capital of the world and set more targets. And those targets are even more ambitious because we never achieved the targets we set before. So we are digging ourselves into a hole, continuously digging ourselves into a hole from which we will never get out. It's all talk.
Correct.
Lalanath, all your cases, I mean, I remember them being in the media and things like that. Do you feel you got a fair hearing, by the media when these cases went on board? Once again, you're on mute.
For the most part, I think the media is generally supportive of these cases. They report them, and they certainly are, carry plenty of articles on climate change and how it's an existential threat and so on. But what is really concerning with regard to the media, not just in Sri Lanka, in any country, is that, after all, the media is, at the end of the day, part of the corporate sector as well. I mean, they are profit-making companies. And they are therefore heavily influenced by the corporate sector. So you get very mixed messages, I would say, in much of the media, where you will have strong environmental messaging, but at the same time you also get strong developmental messaging about developing what they see as a wasteland, when in fact it's not a wasteland at all. It's in fact a very productive wetland. So that is the problem with the media, that it's always this mixed messaging, and it's very hard for the common citizenry to wade through this mire of mixed messages to figure out exactly what is the right thing. So So that's really the problem I see with the media. Generally they are quite supportive of EFL. They've been quite supportive of EFL as well as other such organizations and activists around the world. Here's the thing. I mean, there's all this question also revolves around culture and vocabulary. So somebody, who's working for EFL or an organization like the Environmental Foundation would be spoken about in the North, in the West, in the US, in Europe, as an activist organization. It is an environmentalist organization. But the way in which sometimes the media, and particularly driven by corporate and sometimes by government, tends to classify these organizations as saboteurs, as eco-terrorists, as people who are there to disrupt development. So this vocabulary, this classification of through this use of this kind of vocabulary is actually quite disturbing, and it's very of great concern, because the impression that you leave is that these are really people who are making trouble, and that tends to be the attitude certainly of the corporate sector, and of maybe sometimes in government as well, with regard to civil society organizations. I worked for government as well for 2 years with the Ministry of Environment, so I know from the inside that it is really difficult to convince the government, for example, to bring a civil society organization onto a committee, or an environmentalist onto a committee, or to convince a corporate sector board to include 1 or 2 environmentally or green-minded people on their boards. It's really, really hard. And you might succeed in 10 cases, you might succeed in 1 or 2 of actually making that happen. So this broad education in this area, take them back to school idea, I think is a good one. Whether we do that through the media or whether we do that through our schools, I think we need lots more effort in this area to change the mindset, which is part of the problem. If I can just throw in one other idea, I think there's also something better that we as environmental groups and as environmentalists, as people concerned for the environment, can do. And that is developing much stronger narratives around the science that we base our arguments on. So I worked at the World Resources Institute for a long time. And there you have, very good scientists and economists, and there are people who do a lot of research. They base their findings and recommendations on research and findings and data and analysis and all of this rigor that goes with the science, as it should be. But believe me, the change from research to policy to law is extremely slow. Politicians don't read half of those documents. I would say probably read less than 1% of the documents that scientists and reasoned argumentation is made. Politicians probably read less than 1% of them. And even in the government, probably reading of this kind of material and being convinced is very, very, very low. And so we have to do a better job of creating stronger narratives out of the science in order to convince policymakers. And I say this often, for many thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I mean, how long has Homo sapiens been on this earth? 75,000 years, 100,000 years, whatever, I'm not sure of the period, but a very long time. Whereas writing, communication by written words and pictures and so on, is about 7,500 to 10,000 years old. How did we, before writing ever came about, how did we communicate our messages, our learning, our experience? It was through narrative. And so I believe that human beings are actually wired, biologically perhaps even wired, to imbibe, to take in and to act on narrative, on powerful narratives, much more than they are to act on data and scientific argumentation. And that is why you find that politicians, actually, who are able to develop very strong narratives, as they happened in Germany during Nazi time, could actually motivate large populations to move in a direction that is terrible because of powerful narratives. And you have these narratives all over in the political world, you see it. we as scientists and environmentalists have to do a better job of creating powerful narratives that will get people to change their behavior and move with us. And that is where I think communications and narrative really needs to play a much bigger role in what we do with regard to our advocacy.
That's a good thought to hold. Valmik, you
Just
put your
quickly
hand up.
say that at some level, the media in my country has regressed in the last 25 years to the extent that they believe ignorance is bliss. So it's quite simple. The electronic media and the written media don't have anyone specialized in the field of anything to do with the environment, the forests, and the wildlife. They have general people who cover the issue. They don't do their homework. They're ignorant, so we get the most ridiculous pieces in the press. Electronic media reporting is pathetic. The people who report it have not gone deeper into the subject. So I agree with the earlier speaker that there has to be a dissemination of information, of the science, and with that, the strategy for policy. But for that, a lot of the people who are scientists and who are deeply involved with their subjects need to get columns in newspapers. The newspaper editors need to give them space so that they can write simply, they can write regularly, and the electronic media must bring them on television. They bring every Tom, Dick, or Harry on television today. Any little scandal, the person is on television. They forget about a future vision. We have no future vision. We live on that day. What is the scam to be talked about? What is the scandal? What's something happening in Bollywood? This gets more attention than human survival. And that is the tragedy of what's happened in 25 years. We've regressed. Our media's regressed. Our journalists don't have the specialization to write in the right way.
As a take home, I'd like to ask Eric, what should we take home? What should our next step be, our call to action? So
I think we have a lot of work to do, Savitri. We have to reach out to a lot of stakeholders, from the general public to the corporate sector to the politicians, internationally, nationally, and at the local level. But the narrative, Lalanath, need not be written, but all you have to do is look around you, right? And it's pretty stark what you're seeing, what's happening, and you feel it, and you're living it. And that should be a message by itself. That should be enough to make you feel threatened. That should make you feel that that your future is at stake here. So if that doesn't change you, I don't know what a written article could do to change your perceptions or your behavior. Because things are getting desperate. So we need to keep persevering, but we need to use everything at our disposal. We need to reach out to everybody that we can, at the grassroots level, at the people who are at the forefront of the environmental impacts, to sitting in boardrooms.
okay, Lalanath, just very briefly, a sentence or two. What would be our call to action?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with Eric that we can see all the things that are around us. It speaks to us. But the problem, as George Bernard Shaw said, the problem with communication is the illusion that it has happened. We think we have communicated our messages. We think that the environment around us is communicating this very clearly to us. But the fact of the matter is that from the vast majority of the population, it is not speaking to them, and it is not being clear enough. For example, if there's a wildfire out here in the United States or anywhere in Australia, there will be some noise made by politicians. Yes, maybe climate change has something to do with this, but they never say this is because of climate change, and make that clear connection, because the scientists are still not at the point of the science to be able to say this particular fire was actually caused by climate change. They can say, they can make predictions for the region, they can make connections for larger areas, geographic areas, but to be able to pinpoint. And so this allows politicians to not really highlight the issue. I just want to end by saying, just as eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, so also eternal vigilance is the price of a healthy environment and the price of a thriving nature. So we have to continue to be vigilant and to continue to do what we're doing in the best way we can.
Thank you, Lalanath. And last word, please, Mr. Thapar.
My last word has to go to the younger generation of all our countries, everywhere in the world, but particularly in South Asia. It's our job to hand over the baton. And we have to hand it over in some engaging, exciting way. Whether we create centers of learning, centers for training, whether we give them decision-making roles, we have to encourage the youth who are growing up in their 20s, even in their 30s, to engage in detail with what's left. After all the damage that has been done in 2021, it is in their hands that we have to hand over the baton saying, come on, fight the battle we fought it our lives through. Keep fighting. Don't give up. Don't get despondent. There's a spark somewhere on the horizon. It will minimize damage, but let's go with you. Let's do what we can for that younger generation to engage and excite them. Our time, my time, is going, and the baton has to be handed over.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Eric, Lalanath, Valmik, and also to Hasanthi. Thank you very, very much. May I now hand over for the vote of thanks to Mano Urugodawatte, Wildlife Scientist and Director of EFL.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And what I would like to say is that EFL is no longer youthful, but we are very, very hopeful at 40 years of delivering justice for nature. And as Valmik said, defending the defenders. And remember, we are all here today in this really strange virtual reality because of what we have done to the environment. And this panel has given us a reality check. So, is the state the sole custodian of the environment? And is safeguarding nature just the remit of the environmentalists and the scientists? These are things that we have to think about. Remember, as Dr. Vikramaniac said, we are the tenants, and stewardship is the rent. I would like to close by thanking our esteemed panelists. Mr. Thapar, thank you so much for joining us in this electronic format, in this very, very strange world and troubled world we live in. Thank you for inspiring a lot of young people who have joined this conversation. Lalanath, thank you again for your words of wisdom and giving us a sense of history. And I would like to thank Ms. Dissanayake for her insights on the environment and the role of government. And I do hope that we can forge some kind of working relationship in those of you in government with civil society. And lastly, Eric, thank you for joining us and still our chair. So in addition, I would also like to thank Savitri for moderating, for kindly agreeing, and our media sponsors, Financial Times, Lanka Business Online, and News First. Thank you everyone for joining us. And last but not least, I would love to thank our team who's worked tirelessly on this. And Mr. Thapar, you would love to know that they're all under 30, most of them. So you've reached your target audience. Thanks so much.